23rd lesson in our last video lesson on progressiveness looks at the progressiveness of Woodrow Wilson, the last of the major progressive presidents. Okay, Wilson is one of the more interesting progressives. A lot of people consider him probably the greatest of the progressive presidents, but as we'll learn in this particular lesson, he has many flaws. Now, we've introduced Wilson across a number of different lessons, but just a quick recap on his background. Wilson is a believer in what he calls justice, okay, and liberal ideals, and he tries to bring these ideas of justice and liberal progressiveness to his domestic and foreign policy while he's president of the United States. In foreign policy, however, he will struggle to stay true to his ideals. Though this is not necessarily examined, it's important to note that Wilson, a man of peace and self-determination, will preside over an America that's expanding as a colonial power and will lead it into the First World War. Wilson probably also needs to be considered a racist. Wilson will, in fact, go to great lengths to desegregate or to reintroduce segregation, rather, into the federal civil service. Wilson is born in the South. He has sympathy for the Southern cause in the Civil War. His family is of the Southern secessionist cause, and he is absolutely no friend to the black man in the United States whatsoever. Wilson is, of the three presidents, the most successful in terms of getting progressive reforms across. He encourages Congress, who work with him pretty handily because he dominates Congress as a result of the Bull Moose election, to pass legislation he favors. Most of the legislation and most of the successes that Wilson will have comes before the outbreak of the First World War, which will dominate from 1914 to eventually America enters 1917, the majority of the discussion in the United States, and then therefore he becomes less interested or less less concerned with the implementation of progressive ideals, and more concerned with how the United States is going to position itself as the world tears itself apart in the First World War. The key legislation, and you will need to know these, okay, so try and internalize them, and I'm not going to go into them in any great detail, but these are all examples of successful progressive legislation. You think about the things that progressives want. Wilson, through the Smith-Lever Act, will help farmers get more training in agricultural techniques to increase their yields and decrease the cost of production. Okay, there'll be introduction of home instruction and new agricultural techniques so that farmers become advanced and that they can reduce the amount of labor required to run a family farm. To support farmers, he'll give what's known as the Federal Farm Loan Act, and this will provide loans to the farmers independent of the banks. So farmers could get long-term mortgage on their house, lower rates of interest, they could buy new equipment, and they weren't necessarily going to be held accountable if the bank changes its rates or the bank was struggling. The banks had always lent money, but at higher interest rates. This allows the farmers to have access to credit at a low interest rate, which allows them to flourish and survive. The Adamson Act of 1916, he had a busy year, gives an 8-hour working day and overtime pay to railroad workers who were involved in interstate commerce. So the federal government can't necessarily regulate what happens in states, but as long as industry, like a railroad, would cross over a state boundary, then it becomes the federal government's jurisdiction. And therefore, the federal government introduces the Adamson Act, which gives an 8-hour workday and overtime for these people. Okay, it also said. It sort of, in that sense, gets overrules the idea that Congress could not get involved constitutionally in state employment law. Now, what this means is the Adamson Act overrides that element of the Constitution and says, well, if they cross over state lines, then in fact it's not single state law, it's plurality of states, and therefore the federal government has dominance. The Keating-Owen Act is targeted at one of the key things of the women's movement, that is the child labor. It bans any article that's produced under a child of 14 years of age being traded, sold, or transported between states. The Keating-Owen Act is actually thrown out of court on a number of different reasons, but then sort of reinstated later on. But nevertheless, it's an example of progressive legislation because the majority of the issues with the Keating-Owen Act don't come up till much later. And lastly, the Lafayette-Siemens Act helped improve the safety, payment, and conditions for sailors and merchant seamen. One of the things that was, I guess, not really talked about is the fact that people who were employed in the merchant and navy, that is, people who worked on cargo ships and transport ships, transporting American industrial goods around the world, made a terrible living. They could barely afford, after a long voyage at sea, any sort of rent. I mean, it was just a horrendous living. And the Lafayette Seamen's Act corrects a lot of the abuses of the high seas. It had been argued because people work in international waters and they're not bound to normal employment law. Well, this changes it. As long as your boat is registered or predominantly works out of an American harbor, those merchant seamen working on your boat have to receive a fair wage. They also have to receive adequate safety provisions. You can imagine, in the rolling, tumbling waves of the Pacific or the Atlantic, people working in the midst of storms didn't even wear things like harnesses to prevent them from being washed overboard. These types of things become pretty much standard in 1915. Wilson is also quite known for trust busting. He's one of the hardest progressive presidents on the trust. The Clayton Antitrust Act of 1914 supersedes any inadequate provisions of the Sherman Antitrust Act. We've talked about this before, so I'm not going to go into detail, okay? It makes it clear, however, that unions are not classified as trusts, okay? Trusts are a merging of different groups or organizations under one singular interest. And it had been argued in court that unions are in fact a form of trust, and therefore workers can't have union representation to improve their lives, because that's like having a trust, and trusts are made illegal under the Sherman Antitrust Act, et cetera, et cetera. Anyways, make a long story short, it says unions are not classified as trusts. And that's a really important point, because what you see now is the growth of the labor movement in the United States and the improvement of working conditions on its back through the ability of people to use collective power to limit the importance of trusts. The act as well will place several restrictions on business that were not explicit in the Sherman Trust Act. Okay, price discrimination in interstate trade was made illegal. Okay, and that is for instance, more particularly targeted at the railroad, something that's prevents railroad companies from, for instance, charging different rates to farmers or to big businessmen. Obviously, big businessmen getting a cheaper rate because of influence, because of volume. It basically says that a rate's a rate. Okay, it also attacks the idea of a holding company. Now, we've talked about, Mr. Souter and I, the holding company before. Don't get into too much details about that, but what it tries to do is limit the powers of these holding companies, which are a way of getting around the trust, if you will. In terms of trade and money, he makes some very important steps. He establishes what's known as the Federal Trade Commission. It's a board of 5 members, and it oversees business involved in interstate trade. And it requires them to prepare annual reports. It investigates their practices, such as their advertising, to make sure that they're not doing anything illegal. Okay? He wanted basically the process of moving money and goods around in the United States to be done fairly. Okay, so he looks at also making a more effective banking and credit system. In 1913, he creates something known as the Pujo Committee, and the Pujo Committee is meant to study how America does business effectively and come up with ways in which Wall Street and the big businesses could be regulated to ensure fairness in the marketplace. Okay, and this commission found that Wall Street had effectively abused their control of money. Okay, just the same way that big business had done with their industrial power. They look at things like Wall Street and J.P. Morgan's influence over Roosevelt in the 1907 election, and concluded that banks should not be allowed to bail out other banks because they'll use this as leverage against the federal government to prevent crises, to get what they want, to limit the importance, to limit regulation on themselves. So as a result, the Congress will pass probably one of the most important acts of Wilson's presidency, and one of the most long-lasting and durable acts of any president has ever put in, and that's known as the Federal Reserve Act of 1913. What this does is it creates a nationwide system of credit, creates an internal American Federal Reserve Bank. It will regulate the rates of interest, so banks can't set exorbitant interest rates on their own, so that all banks have to work within a broad framework, that this is the base interest rate, and you have to stay close to that. It increases the amount of currency in circulation, so banks can't hoard money. It brought the currency under a central control of the federal government and allowed for a coordinated nationwide monetary policy. What does that mean? Well, in short, the creation of a Federal Reserve means that in the case of a crisis, a central bank can set the rules in which all banks must act. Banks that do not follow the rules of the Federal Reserve, in other words, are acting in the interests of themselves rather than the interest of the nation at large, can be then shut down by the Federal Reserve. Additionally, um, Additionally, one other thing is that instead of going to the banks in the times of crisis, companies, large ones, or banks themselves who may be facing out of business can go to the Federal Reserve and the federal government can bail them out, which means that the federal government is not influenced by other banks who help other banks in order to prevent nationwide economic crisis. Such was the case in 1907. And the Federal Reserve is still with us today. It will prove remarkably successful because there was a crisis during the First World War, and the Federal Reserve was able to lend, and that lending avoided a banking crisis because it reliquidized the banks. It was working absolutely famously until the Wall Street crash of 1929 overwhelmed it. In fairness, it would have overwhelmed any central bank in the world. The crisis was that bad, and then served as, if you think of 2008 and the last major financial crisis, the primary way the United States was able to bail itself out and not avoid a catastrophic recession such as what happened in 1929 into the 1930s and the Great Depression. Another major separation from his predecessors is over the result of the tariff. You'll recall that Taft had made the tariff a big issue. Roosevelt had paid lip service to doing something about the tariff, but I keep saying McKinley. Taft had made that a big issue, and Taft, through the Payne-Aldrich Act and stuff, doesn't go far enough. It's actually something that Roosevelt really hated about him. It was one of the major reasons the Republican Party split. Well, when the Democrat Wilson comes to power, he passes what's known as the Underwood Tariff of 1913, and it reduces rates on almost 1,000 major produced items. It increases rates on 100 luxury items, the stuff that's quite rare. Iron, wool, and steel, for instance, become completely tariff-free. A graduated income tax is also introduced, to maintain federal revenues. So the Underwood Tariff of 1913 really, let's just say, it's a monumental step forward in the reduction of tariffs, which is the achievement of one of the major progressive goals. Never again in American history will tariffs ever creep that high. And Wilson, of course, will play a massive role in this. He has to work incredibly hard to avoid, to make sure that he has the votes in Congress, to ensure that lobbying, that is the pressure put on by organizations outside of the government to prevent a reduction in tariffs. They hire these guys called lobbyists who basically, from anything from giving money to politicians to threatening them, can try and influence their vote on certain issues. Wilson will counteract the effect of lobbying by working extremely hard for the passing of the Underwood Tariff, and it's one of his greatest achievements. You're probably thinking to yourself, well, Wilson's not a bad guy, and well, you'll probably like this as well. The Wilson angers a lot of, let's just say, bigots, and on the other hand, pleases a lot of progressive reformers by appointing the first non-white Catholic to the Supreme Court in the nomination of Louis D. Brandeis. Louis D. Brandeis was the first Jew to be called to the high bench. He becomes, throughout his entire career as a justice on the Supreme Court, a campaigner for ethnic diversity in America. These types of things angered the natives, who saw people like Brandeis as immigrants who shouldn't be allowed to hold some of the highest positions in the land. Brandeis was also sort of earned his name fighting for the women's movement as well. He successfully argued in the case of Miller versus the state of Oregon that law protecting women's workers were legal, and that women could and should be protected from the abuses of cruel factory owners who made them work long hours in squalid conditions. And what's really interesting is Brandeis's major breakthrough that allowed him to really achieve the Supreme Court was the fact that he was able to convince a court for the first time that employers did not have total control over their workplace, that there were some things that superseded the total control they thought a particular person should have. And Louis D. Brandeis is a progressive campaigner on the Supreme Court, and his influence lasts long past the death of Woodrow Wilson. Another achievement, I guess, is the passing of the Prohibition Act. Of course, the Volstead Act, the 18th Amendment. We're not going to go into any detail about this because we have it, is something that is passed. It is a tenet of the progressive movement, and it's passed under the time of Woodrow Wilson. Another achievement of his would be the 19th Amendment. Of course, that would be the votes for women. Now, let's not give Wilson too much credit. Wilson was not in favor of votes for women when he came to the presidency of 1912, but only turns on the issue as a result of women's service during the First World War. And as such, in that case, in that very short term, is instrumental in getting it passed. And it does become an achievement of the Wilson presidency, though let's qualify this by saying he's not overwhelmingly supportive from the get-go. So it's not that this was a key component of his liberal idealism. Anyhow, let's assess Wilson's presidency in domestic terms. Number one, he achieved the main aims of his election promises and his sort of new freedom program that we described in the last lesson. Government became more efficient. Businesses were more regulated. Currency was more flexible. There was a Federal Reserve that could bail companies out. The interests of workers were protected as much as was possible. The Constitution limited the power. Limited the power of, limited the power of party bosses by Wilson. Okay, one of the things that also comes out at this point is the direct election of senators, but that's actually something we'll talk about as an addendum to this particular lesson. The direct election of senators, though it happens under the Wilson presidency, isn't necessarily all to do with the work of Woodrow Wilson. It's more of a factor of other things weighing on him. A gauge on his popularity, if you will, was the fact that he won the 1967 election quite handily, 277 electoral college votes. Gives him a majority in Congress as well, and he does this on the back of his political of his progressiveness. He is not only one of the rare Democratic presidents after the Civil War, he is the first second-term Democratic president since before it. So Woodrow Wilson is, in this respect, quite successful. Now, of course, with all of these lessons and all of the three progressive presidents, we do need to look at the limits. And one of the major limits you're going to need to bring up in any essay or any consideration of Woodrow Wilson, of course, is his impact on race relations, which is minimal at best. He stopped short of better treatment for blacks. In fact, the Southerner Wilson actually sped up segregation in America. He ensured that the federal bureaucracy, those people who work for the federal government, was fully segregated. That included things like the Army, the Civil Service. It's a real tragedy. In fact, when a delegation of black leaders came to protest to him in the White House, he actually, instead of meeting them, had them, basically the Secret Service, come in and escort them off site. They would not even allow them to come into his office. So that just gives you an idea that what this man, who many consider the sort of the pinnacle of American progressiveness at its highest tide, is also deeply flawed when it comes to certain areas. Another thing you need to consider is that Woodrow Wilson leads America to war. And I'm going to give you sort of a brief rundown on the reasons why he does this. This is sort of within the context of your course. It's never been examined. It's not necessarily likely to be examined thoroughly, i.e. I don't think this will be a 20-mark question, but could come as a 10. What are the key reasons Wilson led America to war in 1914? So as such, I do this in a causation framework where I sort of break down the major reasons. So what's the background? Okay, America doesn't join the war. You probably and hopefully know World War I breaks out in 1914. The primary belligerents at this particular point are all European. The British Empire and the French Empire, etc., bringing colonial powers. Even America's northern neighbor, Canada, joins in 1914. But America continues its policy of remaining isolated from the old world. It's known as isolationism. Wilson himself is a lover of peace, and he talks openly about never bringing America into war. He's a man of peace, etc., etc. But ultimately, he does lead America to war as president. As in doing so, he shatters one of the most sacred American traditions, isolationism. To galvanize his country, to get them together, he has to sell them and sell this war in very idealistic terms. He sells that Americans are going to make the world safe for democracy. But as you know, if you've studied maybe at earlier days in GCSE or whatnot, you've studied the fact that Wilson goes to the Paris Peace Conference in 1919 trying to get democracy and self-determination, but doesn't in fact allow it and gives into the sort of the colonial powers who aren't really necessarily into giving everybody the ability to rule themselves. Anyhow, there are several reasons for America's entry to war, and let me just take you through them. The first one is the anger caused in the United States by the sinking of the Lusitania in 1915. The Lusitania is a ship. It's a passenger ship. It's not dissimilar to like the Titanic, only a bit smaller. It's an American ship. Germany in 1915 wanted her submarines to fire upon any ship, okay, traveling to the British Isles. The British were, of course, an enemy of the Germans, okay, and the Germans declare the British Isles a war zone, okay. Wilson complains to the Germans, and he says this is ridiculous because Americans are neutral. We're friends with the British. People travel back and forth, and of course they're not only that, they're selling them lots of war stuff. But the Germans don't listen. In February 1915, a German submarine sinks the Lusitania. It's a British liner, rather. It's carrying American passengers. Also has some weapons purchased by Britain from America. 11,000 people are killed. 128 of the dead were American citizens, many of whom men, women, and children, innocent families traveling to meet relatives, etc., etc. The Germans halt unrestricted submarine warfare, but what I guess the first consequences is, let's just say, the push factor. The Americans begin to get angry, and a lot of the arguments for bringing America into the war are framed later on in the context of, well, remember the Lusitania. Now, it doesn't cause America to go to war because this happens in 1915 and America goes to war in 1917, but it's the beginning of the talk amongst the political class in America and amongst the people that perhaps this war will affect us after all. The second reason is U.S.'s commitment to democracy. Okay, Germany, seen as the predominantly belligerent country, was led by a Kaiser, a king. Wilson had concluded that Germany was a threat to U.S. security and trade and to morality, and saw the war as part of a crusade to institute democracy worldwide. He stated, for democracy, for the rights of those who submit to authority, to have a voice in their own governments, for the rights and liberties of small nations. This was the exact quote when he announced America's entry into the war. So there's an element of he saw the enemy as being undemocratic, and therefore it was good to go to war. Okay. This is probably, for many Americans, the most convincing of the causes. It convinced people and politicians alike that by going to war, they not only were breaking isolationism, but it was right to do so. One of the other interesting ones, there's a really good podcast on the discovery of the Zimmerman telegram that I will try and attach to this lesson. The Zimmerman telegram it's quite interesting, actually. It is really debatable whether it was a British plot or it was actually the Germans being absolutely careless. But what happens is the German minister cables the German ambassador in Mexico City, telling him to offer some U.S. territory, namely Texas, New Mexico, and Arizona, to Mexico if they join a war with Germany in the event the Americans get entry into the war. Well, the Zimmerman telegraph is intercepted, and it's published. It's made common knowledge, and it shows a lot of Americans that the Germans are plotting against them, and that it is, again, right to fight these Germans. Russia's withdrawal in 1917. Russia surrenders to the Germans in 1917. In 1918, they signed the peace treaty of Brest-Litovsk. And the government in Russia is communist. It's Bolshevik. Okay, that's what they call themselves. The communists call themselves the Bolsheviks. They were led by Vladimir Lenin, the hero of the communist cause. This allowed the German army that had been fighting, really effectively divided in two, that had been fighting Russia in the east and the other half fighting France in the west and England in the west, to concentrate all its forces on the Western Front against the British and the French. the millions of men transfer from the now defunct Russian front, because they'd won the war over there, to the Western front. And it really looked into 1917 and 1918 that Germany could win the war. And this, of course, coalesces fears, and also, Americans who are thinking that this is a good idea because of the rights of morality and justice and all of those types of things are like, well, we can't let Britain and France lose this war. We need to help them. Therefore, the Russia's withdrawal, I would argue, sort of begins to speed up Americans' entry into the war. The final point and the final reason is, of course, traditional links to Britain and trade with the Allies. Okay. Um, Historian Harry Barnes argues the U.S. entered the war for economic considerations. The idea that Wilson didn't want to enter the war, he argues. Wilson entered the war because he had to. Okay. Influential American bankers, munitions makers, that is, factory owners who make guns and bombs, etc., who had made loans to the United States and had made from the United States to Britain, did not want to lose their investment. Okay, if Britain was defeated, they would lose their investment. Therefore, we need to go and defend Britain. Therefore, we get our money back. In 1914, the U.S. exported $40 million in munitions to Britain. It's a huge sum if you consider that's in 100 years ago's money. Okay, and by 1916, it goes up to $1,290,000,000. Okay, the Americans become known actually as the merchants of death because of the amount of munitions they're selling to the European powers, and as a result, with this amount of money on the line and the population divided, the bankers push for it. Additionally, and it needs to be considered, that the traditional links with Britain, okay, force a lot of people, who are multi-generational links to the British Isles, to think that we cannot let old England go down, for instance, okay? And those sort of outweigh the sentiment of the Germans, who were like, let's not get involved against the Germans. The British ancestry was more profound, more integrated into the political class in particular. Not only the fact that the British put a huge propaganda campaign. They want America's help. So they spend huge amounts of money and effort on propaganda to show how horrible and just despicable the Germans are. And here's a wonderful example, okay, of a German carrying a bat that reads culture. Okay, and they're going to smash your culture. It looks like it has brains on it already. He's picked up a beautiful woman and is going to dishonor her in some way. He's wearing a German hat that says militarism, which is basically saying that if Germany is going to become this military power, it's going to take everyone out. And it's not a consequence that he's standing on a shore or a log, probably the shore of America, and that he soon will be coming for you if you don't help us. And then, of course, there's the racist caricature of a monkey representing the Germans, which is meant to stoke the fears of Americans who associate that with black brutality. Anyhow, pretty profound stuff, but that had a powerful impact on them as well. So that's the lesson on Wilson, and those are the reasons why he entered into the First World War. He's a man of great achievement, but a man of great limits, and you're going to have to balance that out on whether or not he is a good progressive president.